I'm Johnny Buchanan. What we're going to do in this episode is to explore what happens when we change the order of the inserts that we apply to the sounds within our mix, otherwise known as why the order of the effects chains that you put together matters. Let's just have a listen to the track we're going to be working on, and then we'll begin to explore what happens when we start changing inserts around.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me. And when I see you, I don't know you. And when I touch you, I can't reach you. And when I see you, I can't face you anymore. No, when I see you, I don't know you. And when I touch you, I can't hold you. And when I see you, I can't face you no more.
Okay, so there is the foundation for our pop record. Vocal at the top, kick drum, and then some plucky synths all towards the bottom. Okay, now it's the vocal we're going to be concentrating on within this track, although we're also going to see a really extreme case of why it matters that we put the effects that we're working on in the correct order in a little while too. Okay, so on this vocal, what I've got is an EQ. I've then got a de-esser, which is providing a sibilance taming. So in other words, where the sound gets SE, effectively we've got a control, which is just getting those things under control. And if you haven't experienced de-essing before, do go and watch our video about that particular plugin. What we've then got is compression, which is dynamically controlling the response of the whole vocal. And then what I've got is a space designer, which is providing a sort of plate reverb on this vocal. And it's here that I want to start this idea that the effects chain order matters so much. So what happens with inserts is that effectively you can kind of think about plugging plugins in. That's a really silly sentence for me to have started, but I'll try and finish it. One thing after another. So our vocal is the beginning and it gets plugged into whatever we put at the top of our effects chain, the channel EQ in this case. And then that gets plugged into the de-esser, and the de-esser gets plugged into the compressor, and the compressor gets plugged into Space Designer, and Space Designer gets sent to the stereo output. So one thing flows into the next. And the reason why that matters so much is that effectively, as that signal gets passed from one processor to another, the next one, which has a discrete, definite job to do, is going to do that job on whatever the audio input it receives is from the previous plugin. So again, if I'm not really making sense, let's just look at what happens when I swap round the order of the compressor and Space Designer. So what I'm going to do is to solo the vocal for a moment, and we're going to just listen to the verse, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the compressor underneath Space Designer halfway through. And what that's going to do is it means that rather than a vocal which is dry, which is being EQ'd and de-essed and compressed, what's then going to happen is that the compression is going to be applied to the reverb when I move that plugin.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember. All that we are is becoming a memory. Shadows that dance in the night overcome me.
Now you might be thinking, I can't really hear the difference. So let's make it more extreme. I'm going to put the compressor back where it was. And what I'm going to do is to come in here, I'm going to drop its threshold level. I'm going to increase ratio, and I'm going to turn up the output volume a little bit. And now the compressor is going to be working hard. It's back before the reverb now.
You're not the same person when we're together.
So what we get, and hopefully you can hear this, is extreme dynamic control, but a really smooth reverb, because the reverb is being applied after the compressor. Have another listen.
You're not the same person when we're together.
In other words, there is no dynamics control of the reverb because it comes after the compressor. If I swap those two things around and I put the compressor back underneath the reverb, now the compressor is being applied after the reverb.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember.
So what happens now is that the wet, reverberant vocal is being compressed. Now, depending on how extreme I want my reverb to be, you might actually be quite enjoying that. Effectively, what it's doing is it's sort of taking some of the space out of the vocal. In other words, we're hearing less reverb when the vocalist is singing, but we're hearing more in the gaps in between. And up to a point, that's going to work really nicely, but it's going to work much less nicely if what I do is to increase the wet level of the reverb, where suddenly the compressor is going to be fighting against loads more reverb.
You're not the same person when we're together.
And so effectively the reverb is being smashed to pieces by this extreme compression amount because the compressor is desperately trying to sort of find the vocal in the reverb. Whereas again, if I pop it the other side of the reverb for a moment, so effectively the compressor is coming first, we're going to hear that much less extremely. Let's come out of link mode and then we'll actually see this compressor just on the screen the whole time.
You're not the same person when we're together.
So that's a very different sound. There's clearly much too much reverb, but the reverb is smooth because it's not being compressed. So this is a really important example of how the chain of effects that we put together really matters. Now we can think of other examples of that. Let's suppose I decided that I wanted all of the plucked synths within my track to be organized into a track stack. And what I wanted to do is to apply filtering to control the tone of them, and reverb as well. Well, if I put the filter after the reverb, it's the reverb that I'm going to be filtering. And if I put it before the reverb, then I'm going to be filtering the original synths, and then reverb is going to be applied afterwards. Hopefully that makes sense. So effectively, it really matters. Now, we've got lots of creative choices. I'm not saying there is a right way to do this, but just be really aware of the fact that the order of those plugins really does matter. And there is one place where it really does matter, and that is at the output stage. Now, at the moment, we're listening to this track through Mastering Assistant. I'm actually just going to remove that altogether for a moment. And what I'm going to do is to swap it for Logic's adaptive limiter. This is the output limiter, which effectively allows me to add additional kind of volume at the output stage. This is our brick wall limiter within Logic. And what this is going to do is to take the volume up to kind of digital maximum.
You're not the same person when we're together.
Let's just sort out the mix. I'm going to drop the reverb level back down to somewhere more or less where it was. And what I'm going to do is to introduce the rest of the track.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember.
Now what I can see within this mix is that even with the adaptive limiter turned up with 4.5 dB of additional gain, I'm still not really getting anywhere near zero. So what I could do would be to say, okay, I'm going to add some gain to my track. Now gain effectively acts as a kind of input sensitivity for any particular plugin, any channel strip. And what I could do would be to say, right, actually, I've got plenty of gain to play with. I'm going to turn up loads of it. I'm going to add 8 dB of additional gain to my project. And then the sound is going to go into the adaptive limiter, which is going to control its overall output level. That sounds like this.
You're not the same person when we're together. You're not the light in the dark, I remember.
Okay, loads of extra volume. Let's suppose I decide to turn round the order of those two plugins. The adaptive limiter is now taking the volume to within about 3 or 4 dB of maximum, and after that I'm adding 8 dB of gain after that brick wall limiter.
You're not the same person when we're together.
Toast. Okay, so straight away, the adaptive limiter is limiting how loud the volume can get, and it's doing that intelligently as a look-ahead limiter. And afterwards, I'm putting at 8 decibels of gain. Effectively, I'm making sure that after the adaptive limiter, the volume is being pushed up so loud, it's going to distort if I print that mix. The perfect example, I hope, of why it matters which way round these two processes come. And if I did make that mistake, then effectively what I'm going to do is to make sure that my output limit is clipped when I actually bounce my mixes. So let's put the gain back before the adaptive limiter, because of course most of us wouldn't just ignore the fact that our output meter had gone to plus 3.5 dB. But let's add that extra gain back in before it, and now volume will be no longer going into the red.
You're not the same person when we're together.
But we've also got to be really careful, even if we decide we want a really subtle change in the output channel. Let's suppose I decided that with all this extra volume, the bass was a little bit loud relative to the top end. And what I wanted to do just at the last minute, maybe was to add a channel EQ, and I just wanted to put a tiny bit more brightness into my mix at the top, just to add some extra magical sparkle. Well, that's extra volume at a specific frequency area, but nevertheless it's extra volume.
You're not the same person when we're together.
Toast. Again, so effectively what I've done by adding just a tiny bit of extra volume using a plugin which regulates volume, in other words, introduces it as well as having the capacity to take it away, is that I again have added extra volume that has taken my mix into the red. If I decided that I needed this to be brighter, again, the EQ needs to go above the adaptive limiter. Again, it really matters that those plugins are in that particular order. So depending on whether or not you're looking to explore creative options in terms of how one plugin feeds another, or whether or not from this kind of slightly volume regulatory area that we're looking at here in the kind of stereo output channel, we have to be really careful of the order in which we place our effects, but also to recognize the kind of musical potential of reordering things and the fact that that is inevitably going to change the sounds that we work with within our mixes.